Hello everybody and welcome back to LMM. Today I'm at Ransoms and Jacobson in my hometown of Ipswich. Now Ransoms, or Ransoms, Sims and Jeffries as they used to be, once upon a time were a powerhouse of the industrial world. They produced agricultural machinery, turntables, lifting cranes and all sorts. In fact, they were one of the things that put Ipswich on the worldwide map. Today they survive making mowers alongside Jacobson, so they're like a combined company, but they're still going, and it's still something that goes back down to Ipswich's illustrious and once glorious past. One of the things they used to make in their heydays of Ransoms, Sims and Jeffries was traction engines, and today there are no less than 8 traction engines returning to this very site to have a run round Ipswich. Many of the engines had arrived the evening before, but some engines still turned up the morning of the event, and as an enthusiast of vintage machines, it was great to see so many older tractor units still earning their keep and pulling the engines to the event, and really reinforced my desire to have a tractor unit at some point in the future. Once everything had moved around site, it was time to begin the preparation of the engines, and having so many Ransoms engines that were built in Ipswich all being prepared together was quite magnificent. There was a real atmosphere seeing these machines, literal siblings and family, being prepared together to return to the town of their forging. Now for me, I've never seen so many Ransoms traction engines together in one place, and I can't think of anywhere more appropriate than their hometown. In fact, with the company that built them. I mean, this is as appropriate as it could ever be. And there are some absolutely lovely engines here in attendance. First up was a Boudica, owned by the man who had organised this day. She is engine 26995, built in 1916. She's a single-cylinder 7 nominal horsepower general purpose engine, which is typical of Ransoms. She was ordered by the army, although we're not entirely sure where she worked, but we reckon it was somewhere locally, as it was sold off from the army in Colchester in 1920. She then went to Lincolnshire and worked on the Fens until 1960, where she was sold and went to the West Country and acquired the name Mendip Lady. Then she came back to East Anglia in 1996 for boiler work, and she never left. Next was number 24436, built in 1912. She's the same as Boudica, being a 7HG single-cylinder 7 nominal horsepower general purpose engine. She was supplied new to a contractor out in Tasmania and was sent out with a big threshing drum, and then was sold somewhere in the mid-1920s to somewhere else. This history then is rather sketchy, but at some point it was parked up and forgotten about, returning to the UK in 1999 as a derelict hulk, and has since been fully rebuilt and currently lives up in Scotland. The third of the trio of 7 HDs was engine number 30004, built in 1919, Major. She's the same as the other 2 engines in regard of being a single-cylinder 7 nominal horsepower traction engine. She worked up in the fenlands around Peterborough and was fitted with wider rear wheels to spread its weight over the softer soil so it didn't bog down. And she's now owned by fans of the channel, so she's an engine that I hope to be able to do a video on at some point in the future. The first different design was engine 36220 of 1920. This is a compound engine, meaning the exhaust steam from the first cylinder is used a second time in the second cylinder, improving its efficiency. This comes together to be a 4 nominal horsepower engine. This one is particularly relevant because it's the X-Works demonstrator, used to show off what Ransom tractors could do, and as such it received a new works number every year to give it the impression that it was a new engine out on show rather than one they couldn't get rid of. It was finally sold in 1926, and this is the first time that it's been out in 15 years, and I can't think of a more appropriate place for it to make its return. Another compound is engine number 42032 of 1931, although she is an agricultural engine with 6 nominal horsepower. She was sent out to Southern Ireland to work with a thrashing contractor, and she is one of the last 3 traction engines built by Ransoms. It was laid up by 1950, but prior to that, it spent 7 years providing steam for greenhouses for sterilisation purposes. The best thing about its history is it was purchased by a Reverend Coley in 1960, who at one point had 5 other engines, but it turned out he'd bought them all from the collection plate, so he had to give them all up. It eventually came back to the UK for restoration, being purchased by the current family in 1974. Moving on to presumably the second to last engine, but I get very confused with the numbering system of Ransoms had in those final years, is engine number 42036. She came out in 1931, but they couldn't sell her. So in 1932 it went to a Lincoln show and was put in front of the Ransom stands, where a farmer decided to buy it and took it home to his farm in Langham. But his sons thought that this was a stupid idea, as they were big on the new internal combustion tractors, which were damn sight easier to use, so it wasn't worked and ended up just being parked in the orchard and forgotten about, until it was purchased by its current family, who restored it back to working order, which means it's quite rare in steam engine terms, being only on its second owner. Moving on to something that I'd not actually seen in the flesh before, a crane engine. This is engine number 31066 of 1920 and is perhaps the most appropriate engine to be taking part, as this was Ransom's own engine. It was used about their factory for moving various bits and pieces about. In fact, it spent its entire working life at the factory until they scrapped it in 1943 or 1944. It was eventually rescued and restored, with the current owners taking it on in the 1980s. It features such cool modcons as power steering, which is really trick, but makes sense, allowing it to be steered when it had a heavy load hanging by the jib. I think this thing is absolutely awesome. It also had a mighty top speed of 3 miles an hour. But the very greatest thing is its name. It carries possibly the greatest name ever gifted to a crane engine. This is Hooky. Finally was something not normally associated with doing a road run. This is a 2 nominal horsepower portable number 22988 of 1910, which spent its working life in Chile. It's a very desirable size, as it can be transported around on a car trailer. Not much is known from its life across the sea, other than it was repatriated in 2009 and restored. The journey it will make today would likely represent the furthest it has ever travelled on its own wheels, which were normally used for positioning the thing to where it would work, rather than transporting it across the town. It's also the engine I would like to own most, as I have a real soft spot for portables. It was incredible to be able to walk around so many engines that started their life in my hometown. And although this was a Ransoms event, they weren't the only vintage vehicles taking part. Foremost amongst these was the Ipswich Transport Museum's ex-Suffolk Fire Service Bedford, which had been converted into a pickup truck. This would be leading the procession through Ipswich, and as an ex-fire appliance was a machine that I was quite interested in. In addition to the pickup were a pair of Model T Fords. Now these things are truly fabulous, and I had the opportunity to drive one when I was out in the States a few years ago, and so if you want to check out what it's like to drive one of these mechanical marvels, check the video that's coming up on the screen now. Now pay attention to these two, because these will turn out to be relevant later on in the video. By now it was time for the briefing, and everybody gathered in the reception area of the Ransoms office, which was wholly appropriate. In this, the plan for the day was unfolded, including maps and directions for the traction engines to follow, and then the opportunity was taken to have a group photo in front of the Ransoms logo. And from there, it was time to head out and get the engines all lined up, ready to make their departure. And getting to see Ransoms machines trundling around the grounds of the factory was absolutely magical. Now, before we get too misty-eyed about reminiscing about these engines returning to the factory, it's important to note that none of the engines here were actually built at this location. This is the Nacton Road site, which then became Ransoms Europark. The company moved here in the late 1960s, whereas their previous factory had been down on the docks. And that was one of the locations that we were going to be visiting today, which truly would be taking the engines back to their birthplace, whereas this was just their spiritual home, although it was truly special for them to be at the headquarters of their namesake. Now you may be wondering, what momentous date are we celebrating by bringing all of these ex-Ipswich machines back to the town in which they were built? And the answer to that is, there isn't one. The guy who is in charge and has organised this owns himself a Ransoms engine and decided that this would be a really good idea. So there's no date, there's no celebration, there's no anniversary, just seemed like one of those good ideas that you started with your mates that's now got a little bit out of hand. And here we are, early on a Saturday morning. By this point, most of the engines had steam up and had their preparation work completed, and they were starting to muster together, ready for the big off as they would head out onto the streets of their hometown. However, The engines weren't going to be leaving as one solid unit. It had been decided that all of them heading onto the road would cause too much chaos, so it would be a staggered departure. But we did have a brief moment with 4 of the engines lined up prior to departure outside the headquarters of Ransoms, which was truly glorious. And then, with the final preparations complete, like putting the spark arresters in, the first few engines were ready to depart. And then, with no accolade, they departed, heading out of the factory's grounds towards the roads. It was only right that the gentleman who organised the event was the first traction engine to leave Ransom's new site. And this was glorious, watching a product of the company departing its gates once again. And I should take this moment to say a massive great thank you to Ransoms for allowing this event to take place. There was of absolutely no benefit to them for this happening. In fact, it cluttered up their yard Friday through to Monday. But it was a glorious thing to do, to be able to refresh those tyres back with their once illustrious past, when they used to make machines that were known the world over. And to have such a variety of engines that had worked all over the world in attendance really helped to hammer home those links. And now the road run had begun, you would have assumed that all of the traction engines would be making their way to the road. Well, not so. My friends who owned a Major couldn't leave the factory complex without posing their engine in the industrial setting. And frankly, who could blame them to have the opportunity to have your engine surrounded by a scene like this, where you could believe that this was the very place that it had been forged, was an opportunity not to be missed. And certainly the guys weren't satisfied with just one. They had to reposition the engine for another photo shoot. This also had the opportunity of taking them over one of the last remaining sections of railway at Ransoms. And so it was really cool to get these 2 obsolete forms of transportation for Ransoms together again, to see the traction engines and to see the railway. The next engine to leave after Major's impromptu photo shoot was 36220, and this is quite a fast little engine, so it nipped out of the complex too quickly for us to actually get any shots of it. The next departure was perhaps the one that I was most excited for. And this, of course, was Ransoms number 42032 dragging the little portable. And as I'd mentioned earlier in the video, this was likely going to be the furthest the portable had ever moved on its own wheels. And you'll see here that I've attached my GoPro to the regulator handle of the portable to give an angle never seen before as it is moved to its new location. Now pay attention to that fact of where I put the GoPro because it's important for later on. Seeing a small portable being moved by a traction engine is a sight that I personally have never seen before, but I was so glad that the 2 owners had come together to be able to make this happen because it looked awesome. I think my favourite thing about all of this was the fact that the owners said they'd had to fill up the axle boxes on the portable for the first time. Normally, when they take it to a show, it gets offloaded from the trailer where it's going to stay. At the end of the show, it gets put back on the trailer, taken back to their storage, and then offloaded. It doesn't actually rack up much mileage at all, whereas this time, it was actually very much going to pick up some mileage, and thus needed some lubrication. The idea of the portable engine was that it could be dragged to where it was needed, by a horse, by an ox, or with a traction engine just like this, although when you were moving it large distances, it would be moved most likely by rail and then taken the short distance via road. So going for this long run round the town would likely legitimately be some of the furthest distances that it had ever done. And as the 2 engines disappeared off onto the roads, the next thing to depart the works was Hooky. And as this machine made its departure at a mighty 3 miles an hour, I decided it was time to hop in the car and try and overtake them to get some more shots. Although this didn't really go to plan. Elsewhere, it soon became apparent that the traction engines had very different road speeds. with this overtake taking place soon after they'd left the ransom site. Meanwhile, stuck in traffic, overtaking was all I could dream of. Although it did turn out it wasn't just me having to deal with the stop-start nature of modern town life. On the other side of town, I'd finally got a green light and was moving again, but as was Major. It's almost like there's a load of slow-moving vehicles moving around the town. Actually, no, it's not. The big problem at the moment, they've chosen a really poor time to do this because the Orwell Bridge, which carries the A12, the A14 over the Orwell River, which is the main way of getting around Ipswich, currently is down to one lane in both. It's basically two bridges side by side and one bridge is closed. So rather than it being a dual carriageway, it's now single carriageway. And for the last 3 weeks and for the next 4 weeks, Ipswich doesn't move. This is a weekend. And it doesn't move because the traffic's all trying to fight through the town to avoid the very long delays. Add some traction engines to it, and I thought we were just going to buzz around town and overtake them, but... The only consolation was that it wasn't just me fighting through the traffic. 2 of the traction engines had also run foul of the red lights and had bunched up. Although, as you can see looking in front, it wasn't actually them causing any of the traffic jams, as the traffic had just bunched up naturally. Then came my favourite, the traction engine pulling the portable on its potentially longest ever run on its own wheels. Now, as this goes past, I want you to pay particular attention to the regulator, which, if you remember, is where I'd put my GoPro. The observant amongst you will notice that it is no longer there, and that is because it had fallen off. Luckily, it had been picked up by this sterling gentleman in his Model T Ford, who decided that he'd also turn it back on his Model T Ford, so we get a bonus view here of being on board a Model T Ford. Further out of the town, I'd finally got in position to be able to see Major as it came past. Meanwhile, the super nippy ex-demonstrator tractor had already managed to navigate the entirety of the one-way system. In fact, it had long gone through, meaning that it evaded our cameras yet again. In fact, it had been so nippy that it was overtaking the normal traffic, and had managed to visit all of the landmarks on the route, including Portman Road Football Stadium, and made its way up to the old bus depot, where it had caught up with Boudicca, which was taking a breather. In fact, the thing was so nippy that, not content with completing the route once, it immediately went back into Ipswich and looped round for a second time, which is where we finally managed to see it, and I managed to retrieve my GoPro. And speaking of catching things up, the Model T Ford who'd managed to recover my GoPro caught up with the offending engine that had discarded it in the first place. The Model T overtook and disappeared, and eventually the traction engines returned from their tour around Ipswich, heading back to the Dock Spur roundabout, where they had special dispensation to drive along the waterfront on the normally pedestrian-only area. So after a fraught journey through Ipswich, where I got to see basically none of it, in my head I had this super plan of nipping past stuff because I know the back streets, and it's just not happened. Then there's been some misinterpretation of the route, and when people should have gone that way, they've gone that way. And so some people have done this on purpose for a shorter run, and some things like the crane over there is just teleported, because I left that at Ransoms and then I travelled in a significantly faster vehicle here, and then it was here. But anyway, we've arrived on the waterfront. This was once a hub of industry, which has been redeveloped and turned into, well, a very nice part of the town. But when I was growing up, this was still, well, derelict, with the railway running through it and all. So it's lovely to see so much industry that was built here, and a lot of it would have been shipped out via this very port back here again. And there's a lot of public being like, what on earth is going on? It's quite marvellous. Waiting for us on the waterfront was the last engine in our lineup. This is Ransoms number 42035 of 1932, Vernon. And this engine is of particular importance to be on this run, because to the best of my knowledge, this is the last traction engine to be built by Ransoms, which meant it just had to be here. She was sold to agricultural dealers Arthur M. Cole up in Norwich, and was first registered in 1935. She then went through a couple of different owners, but always remained in Norfolk, before being sold into preservation to a Mr. J. Vernon of Market Bosworth in 1962. She is a 6 nominal horsepower AG compound traction engine. She's also been modified throughout her preservation life, and was fitted with a third gear, which allows her to have a higher top speed when she's going along the road without having to have the crankshaft flying around at silly speeds. It was simply wonderful to have these engines lined up in close proximity alongside the waterfront, and the engine that I was most pleased to see was the little portable, midway into potentially the furthest it had ever travelled on its own wheels. As a big advocate for getting people interested in heritage, this was a fantastic event, being in the middle of the town, for the public to come and get up close and personal with engines that were built in their hometown was an amazing opportunity. And it was so good to see so many people excited by these old machines, coming and having a look and chatting to the owners and getting involved. This is exactly the kind of event that we should be doing more often. And once the owners and crew returned from their lunch break, the cavalcade set off together along the waterfront. You may be asking yourself, why is there a load loader taking part in this procession? Well, sadly, during the morning, number 24436 failed at the Natton Road site. But undeterred, it stayed on the low loader, which was then pulled around so it too could take part in the road run. It really is quite a strange sight. The engine that's almost 100 years old, passing the new flats. Both integral parts of Ipswich and this landscape, despite being entire worlds apart. The plan had been for the engines to proceed in a cavalcade along the waterfront back to the site of the original Ransom factory, the place where they were all forged. However, a gate that needed to be open wasn't so this forced a radical rethink of the plan and temporarily caused a traffic jam of traction engines as they pondered their next move. The solution was for everything to turn around and head out onto the road and progress via the road back to the Ransom site. Meanwhile, I'd run on ahead to get another shot of Hooky. And then I hung around on the roundabout to see the stragglers coming back to the old Ransoms factory. As the low loader turned up with the last engine, it occurred to me that I'd parked at the other end of the waterfront, and my parking ticket was running out. So I had to hot-foot it back, and by the time I returned to the works, I was in time to see some stabling going on to recreate a scene, with Hooky reversing up outside the works building.
The only disappointment was there was a car parked in the middle of the scene, and despite our best efforts, the owner could not be found. So in order to lose it, you had to stand in just the right position for Hooky to shield it, and then you had a timeless scene as it was when they were new.
Part of the plan of all of this was to come back here to the old Ransoms works. Glorious.
And it really was. To have the engines back at their literal birthplace was nothing short of incredible. 3 Ransoms engines lined up outside the place where they were made. All good things though have to come to an end, and it was time to head off towards the evening's destination, which was Ipswich Transport Museum. As the day was getting on, only 2 of the traction engines elected to follow the planned route back through Ipswich towards the Transport Museum, with the other engines deciding that they would take shorter routes and go directly to the Transport Museum. So we figured we'd be able to get a couple more shots of these two as they made their way through Ipswich. And once again, the traffic had other ideas. But we did manage to set up to get them as they stormed up Vauxhall Road here. We figured from here, if we went straight to the Ipswich Transport Museum, we stood a fair chance of beating a couple of the traction engines and could film their arrival. Several of the engines, including our favourite Hookie, had beaten us to the Ipswich Transport Museum, who very kindly had offered to stable all of the engines overnight and were putting on a do for the crew. And so yours truly got invited in as well. It was great to have all of the engines lined up together in the Transport Museum, and the next day, on the Sunday, they were opening the doors so the public could come in and see all the traction engines together. But for now, it turns out that this quite large exhibition space becomes quite small when you're trying to fit 8 traction engines in. There was a lot of shunting back and forth to make room for all of the machines. And with all of the engines stabled, there was nothing else to do but have a drink and visit the barbecue and appreciate the engines ticking over in the half light. What an outstanding lineup this was, with some absolutely fabulous mechanical marvels.
So that brings us to the end of this video. Everything is now safely parked up here at the Ipswich Transport Museum, and this, I believe, is the greatest gathering of Ransoms, well, certainly in Ipswich, since they left the factory. It's been marvellous to see so many products of my hometown reunited back together again, trundling around the streets of which they were built. It's been great. Going back to the current factory and then to the factory where they were built has been wonderful. It's just such an epic thing to do, and the best thing of just doing it because, hey, I've had a really good idea, let's get a load of Ransoms together and bring them back home. I just love that kind of madness. It's brilliant. So it's been just wonderful. So with that, that's the end of this video. I hope you've enjoyed watching. If you have, how about clicking somewhere over there for another one with tractors and traction engines, down there for some steam on the rails, and, well, I'm going to go see if I can find myself a burger. Ta-da!